Okay, welcome to everyone this evening, and welcome back, especially to those who are joining us from last semester. This is the second semester, the second of 4 semesters of the Core Enaction program at Mind and Life Europe. I'd just like to really just thank all of the participants this semester, those who are in the live Zoom room with us, and those who are following us on YouTube. And just to say that it was really heartening and impressive to us to read all of your applications and to read about all of your backgrounds coming from 29 different countries, and which is really testament, I think, to the perennial interest and relevance of this particular field of exploration. So I'd like to pass the baton to Amy Varela, just to say a couple of welcoming words, and then to our host this semester, Dr. Marek McGann.
Thank you, Johanna. For my part, I want to welcome you all to this second semester of Core Enaction, and I wanted to take a minute to thank the MLE team, Gabor, Johanna, May, and Derek, for all the input and following along step by step with all of this and the support that they've given in developing this program. And a very warm welcome to Marek, our host, and to all the presenters who will be here, a few of whom are already here, I think, joining us at this session. And jumping into this experiment with us, because Core Enaction really is an experiment that we concocted in response to what we perceived as the desires and the needs of the MLE community and beyond the MLE community. And in particular, clearly, our desire to deepen our understanding of embodied and active mind. So each one of you is coming here with your own singular motivation and your own singular background. And I hope that you'll all find food for thought and maybe even food for transformation, if I can mix metaphors, during the coming semester. And then in the more collective dimension, I really hope that this experience that we have together will bring out the more enveloping, I would say, the bigger, the wider project of the embodied mind and its authors, which was to furnish the tools for finding a conception of mind that might serve as an antidote to entrenched ideas about mind and subjectivity that give rise to restrictive and individualistic notions of what it is to be a subject, what it is to be a human subject, maybe even what it is to be a more than human subject. These ideas that stress that a very individual mind in the head perspective, skull-bound, as Evan Thompson likes to say, give rise to restrictive and individualistic ideas about subjectivity that in turn then give rise to identity politics, to polarization, to the ills that the authors of the Embodied Mind were already addressing in 1991. And it's only gotten worse, as far as I can see. This makes me think about our theme, our Mind and Life Europe theme for the year, which is caring for life. And so I think that not only will we learn a lot about the embodied mind and all the strands of thought that go into its construction, but maybe we also might learn something about caring for life as we read together. So thank you for joining us in this experiment, and we're fine-tuning it, we're modifying it as we go along. We welcome your ideas and comments, and your lively participation in the discussions is really the biggest help for us to see how we can, what we need to change, what we need to do to find this path that we're laying down in walking. So thank you very much. And I'd like to pass the baton to Marek, our host. Thank you very much, Marek, for taking over this semester.
It's a pleasure, and thank you, Amy, both for the introduction and for the organization, and thanks to Johanna and Gabor and the rest of the team as well, some of you who are only just meeting this evening. So we'll sort of kick things off fairly quickly, just to welcome everyone here, those of you who are returning from the previous semester, and those of you who will be new to the sessions, like myself, just kind of joining in and seeing where the river's taking us, as it were. So I'm very excited, and I hope you are. One of the things that we've mentioned in some of the emails that you'll have received over the past couple of days and weeks, and also for those of you who are in the Slack channel, it's sort of crucial to, I think, the whole thing working is that we manage a dialogue. It's a sort of a fundamental aspect of the enactive approach generally, that the old school information transfer model of learning is a non-starter. It just doesn't get going here. In other classes, I sometimes refer to it as the baby bird model of teaching and learning. Where I've got a whole bunch of pre-digested knowledge in my head that I will, you sort of sit there with your heads open expectantly, and I vomit pre-digested knowledge into you in some manner. And I think basically as a teaching methodology, it's about as appealing as a metaphor, as it is a metaphor. So the only way that really that this will work is through sort of effective dialogue. And effective dialogue isn't necessarily terribly coherent. If you have just sort of some kind of response or sort of half-formed thought that is provoked or evoked by things that are said in class or things that are posted, then respond to them and be sort of quite happy to just articulate something in a half-hearted or a sort of a half-clear manner, because we can all respond to the half-clear just as easily as the sort of more straightforward. And once we get the dialogue going, then it will just get richer as it goes on. So this sort of the discussion will never just be a sort of a back and forth series of questions and answers. So I'm going to get into, there will, though, having said that, there's going to be a certain amount of talking at you, and but at any point, certainly with my own discussion or presentation today, feel free to interrupt, or whether sort of by verbally by sort of using audio, or by throwing a comment into the chat, which I'll try to keep a half eye on and respond to. But the aim is to keep the presentations relatively short so that we have plenty of time for the dialogue. And it's just really the presentations will be the first quasi half-formed bit of thing that gets said. It'll just take a rather long time to say some of it. So I'll sort of get straight to it now, because I'm kind of hoping to make sure we have lots of time for discussion. And of course, now that I've said we want to keep things brief, there's always the possibility that I'm somehow going to run over and talk at you for 90 minutes, but I'll aim to not go too quickly and yet somehow still be brief at the same time. So in the meantime, the first thing to do will be to share some screen here. Okay. So just to confirm, you can all see that? I have some, yeah, okay. Okay, so yeah, that's the hello. We can sort of get straight into, I mean, the whole experiment, as Amy said, of core inaction is a response to a sort of desire to properly get to grips with the inactive approach as a way of thinking about the mind, as a way of approaching cognitive science in its sort of more formal capacity, but also in other aspects and other areas of life where we are dealing with what minds are and people interacting with one another, and of course just interacting with and being in the world in various ways. And so it's a sort of a rich text that has continued to blossom over the past 30 years or 30 plus years now, since the initial publication of the Embodied Mind. But as sort of Amy mentioned, it's a dramatic shift in intuition, particularly for those of us who have formed our intuitions within the context of a Western individualistic mindset. And that makes it that bar to entry is high. It's difficult to get yourself into that way of thinking if you don't have the resources available to do so just naturally in your society, in your culture, and in your community. So the aim is to foster a sort of a bunch of conversations around this sort of initial text as a means of making those resources available, and everyone will have, you know, slightly different things that they're picking up from and working through. But of course, at this point, the text is 32 years old. It was published initially in English in 1991. And there has been a number of very significant developments since. There's been a substantial scientific development on the enactive approach across a number of dimensions since its publication. So we might start with the question, why study or why teach the embodied mind? There are lots of more recent work that we could dig into. Why is this still a good first place to start? I think there's three principal reasons that we might pick up on here. The first, this is the cover as it was back in 1991, at least in English. The book has been generative, right? So even if we just look at books, so putting aside the sort of torrent of academic papers and articles and so on that have been published, we've had this slew of work across a number of different fields in philosophy and cognitive science, most notably, but more recently we're seeing work in areas like psychiatry, in linguistics, and so on. That tells us that as a source, it is a productive and generous and generative one. Though the array of and the diversity of the texts that are available, or the other ways in which we might approach or engage with the enactive approach to thinking, their diversity also kind of tells us that if we're going to pick one, we're immediately sort of focusing in and sort of pushing into the background a whole host of others. But what they all share is a genealogy with the embodied mind in its initial publication, and indeed subsequent republication in 2016, because it has been this sort of productive, generous source. So as the source of all of this diversity, it is a good still first entry point to that. Also, perhaps more so than most of the work that has followed it and followed in its footsteps, is its interdisciplinarity. Now, I think much of the work anywhere across cognitive science tends to be interdisciplinary, but there's a sort of really quite striking reach of the embodied mind as a book itself, which is perhaps not quite as broad in some of the work that's been done since. So the net result is we're sort of tying, again, there are a number of other threads, even more than just listed here, but if we look at psychology, neuroscience, Buddhism studies, computer science, philosophy, and more are sort of brought together and not even necessarily integrated in a sort of a single smooth way, but rather, as Amy's mentioned, and as Francisco Varela put it, these different disciplines rub up against one another. And in doing so, that friction is a sort of a generative form of friction. So when you get stuck into the embodied mind, it is really rewarding. Now, of course, what they've done, what Varela, Thompson, and Rush did in 1991 is essentially broach an entire different perspective on what cognitive science is, how the mind should be conceived, how to integrate viewpoints and perspectives from computer science and artificial intelligence, from philosophy, from psychology, from artificial life, from Buddhism, and from phenomenology, and sort of brought them all into sort of one place. So the nature of that, of course, means that it's also a really difficult text, right? So they did all of that in 250 pages. That was pretty ambitious. And as a result, it's not so much a book that you joyfully read, so much as one that you grind to a halt in somewhere. And it will take, or frequently take, sort of 2 or 3 goes at least to sort of properly get into it. Easy way to do that is to do 2 or 3 goes simultaneously by distributing the workload, right? So we get a whole bunch of people, then we're all reading it simultaneously in 2 or 3 different ways at different times. And that really helps kind of bring things into perspective for us, and will make the whole approach that bit much easier. Finally, I think the sort of a very important aspect of the book is that it's essentially a punk text. It doesn't come across that way. It's kind of low-key and polite in most of the way that it's approached. But it isn't just a science book. It is, and Amy alluded to this in introduction as well, it's a manifesto. It's basically saying we've been doing science wrong. There is another way, and indeed a better way in which to approach our understandings of humanity. If we want a science of humanity, we will need a much more pluralistic perspective than cognitive science has offered thus far. And both Eleanor Roche and Evan Thompson allude to this in their introductions to the revised text. I love the way Eleanor Roche has put it. For 20 plus years, so this was in 2016, for 20 plus years, the book has served as a provocateur for academic and non-academics alike. The authors were not out to make some sort of polite suggestions. The authors were out to needle people and to really jolt people into different ways of thinking. And Evan Thompson sort of notes the same kind of thing. Less noticed than the embodiment, or the importance of embodiment, which everyone seems to agree on now. Less noticed is the enactive approach also implies a certain conception of science. We can no longer hold on to the traditional realist conception of science. And that it really is quite a dramatic and revolutionary intention. So despite the fact that the book is really quite nice and polite, the underpinning it really is something that is ambitious and sort of rather important. So that is sort of a quick overview as to why we would do this. And what we might then do is sort of run straight into our chapter 1 here. And I'll just sort of, essentially I'm going to take chapter 1 in a very conservative manner here. I'm just going to sort of step through it in the sequence that the book itself starts. So we start with this chapter 1, a fundamental circularity. And we have a nice diagram, although that's not actually the circularity we're really interested in here. So it's a little bit easy to get distracted. A little bit more like this. So here's me trying to put together the slides for this evening's or this morning's or this afternoon's talk, depending on where you are, and ending up in this kind of infinite regress. The point being that things that look magical, like me on the screen in front of you with this wonderfully rich and complex audiovisual display, are the product of work. And the understanding the processes of labor and effort and interaction with tools and with other people and so on that go into producing what looks otherwise as a sort of a magical output, such as a scientific theory, matters. It matters in understanding that theory, and it matters in understanding the phenomena involved as well. So when you are a cognitive scientist, trying to get to grips with, well, what is this thing called experience? You have to realize that you are a cognitive scientist with experience as you're going through that process. And so we're immediately stuck into this idea of having to be aware of the fact that we're in the world as we're going about trying to understand the world. And so we have this sort of lovely slogan from Merleau-Ponty in the first couple of pages in the book: the world is inseparable from the subject, but from the subject, which is nothing but a project of the world, and the subject is inseparable from the world, but from a world which the subject itself projects. And crucially, so this is all at the moment, if you're, depending on where you're coming from, we've already lost you, right? So as soon as you sort of put a little recursive thing in, as soon as you start thinking about thinking or thinking about being reflective, it gets awkward and difficult immediately. If you're having that experience, that's okay. That's not an indication that something's gone wrong. It's just an indication that this takes time to get your head around, as it were. Using a very ill-advised metaphor there, but it just takes some time to get used to the idea. And crucially, the idea that we need to get used to is this sort of closed relationship between the knower, the known, and the means of knowing. So I'm drawing a little bit actually from discussions with Fred Cummins, who I'm going to mention a little bit later on here in doing so. So Fred Cummins suggested that a good definition of cognitive science, or if not a good one, then at least a reasonable one to take, is to think of cognitive science as an attempt to understand the knower, the known, and the means of knowing. And the enactive approach starts from the recognition that these three things are not, they don't have sharp boundaries between them, right? So that's why we have to sort of just draw them on a circle and appreciate that if you want to understand one of them, you're going to end up getting tangled up in the others too. And there isn't really a way to sort of just chop out one bit and just focus on that. That would be a bit like pausing the music to listen to the note more carefully. It just misses the point. So what we need are a set of tools and resources for thinking about the whole without necessarily carving it into bits. And that's going to take some effort. So having sort of briefly introduced or thrown us into this idea that we're going to get ourselves tangled in knots, the authors move on to just talk about the idea of what is cognitive science. And this is sort of a part of the book that really bespeaks the time in which it was written. You can hear the optimism and the enthusiasm for the project, even though there is a certain amount of reservation about how the project has been going up to that point. So they talk about, in its widest sense, the term cognitive science is used to indicate that the study of mind is in itself a worth scientific pursuit. So take the mind seriously. It's not something that's either left to other areas of life, which science should not touch because it is sacred in some way, but also that there is many different facets to it, and that these should be allowed to come together and to sort of be explored in a coherent way. So it was a scientific ambition that was centuries in the making, and cognitive science seemed to be this enthusiastic approach that sort of said, well, right, let's roll up our sleeves and do this properly. Let's get everyone together who has a valid perspective on this, and let's learn from everyone all at the same time. And in the late 80s and early 90s, this was a much more optimistic endeavor than it perhaps presently still is. So we'll get onto that in a second. So later on as well, they note that for millennia, human beings have a spontaneous understanding of their own experience, one embedded and nourished by the larger context of their time and culture. And in this, this is part of the important constant refrain through the book of that which has a scientific aspect also has a natural and personal aspect to it. And so cognitive science is something that is trying to sort of sharpen up and tighten up or sort of formally discipline a way of approaching or our understanding ourselves that in fact we do in a less formal way too. So what they try to do, and here's where our sort of a more valid use of our polar diagram here comes back, is to note that there are many different facets or aspects to cognitive science. These are just some of them. So the traditional disciplines here of the interdisciplinary thing that is cognitive science: cognitive psychology, philosophy, linguistics, artificial intelligence, and neuroscience. Sometimes anthropology too. They say it was traditionally one of the founding 6 disciplines of cognitive science as well. But even just within this array, we can see diversity. And while everyone who is sort of given a point on this diagram might accept the term cognitive scientist and be willing to say that they're part of a shared endeavor, they nevertheless have quite diverse ways of thinking. There, at the time, was not agreement on what the questions were, what the methods should be, and what kinds of things would constitute an acceptable or a satisfying answer. So how scattered the points are across that diagram is an important aspect to that diagram itself. And of course, there's a sort of historical or genealogical move from the center to the periphery, from the center where we have clustered the mainstream cognitivist view, which will become criticized and expanded upon. We have this sort of lovely central circle here, which is termed emergence. And that's a term that's actually probably aged the most in terms of what it means in the certainly of the 3 terms there. So emergence is connected with the connectionist view of representation and also the connectionist view of computation, which was desperately exciting in the late 1980s. And well, we'll get onto it in a second, but just isn't so terribly exciting anymore. But even so, having noted that there was lots of excitement around the connectionist view and that it seemed to be a different way of going about cognitive science, it in itself still harbored a bunch of the issues that were causing sort of problems with cognitivism as a foundation too. So, so cognitive science never really was anything specific in the first place. And the question, I guess, is, we'll just sort of quickly take stock of where we've got to now, just so as we have just a little bit of perspective here. And basically, it's just cognitive psychology these days. So the paper from 2019 by Rafael Nunez and colleagues. So don't worry about this graph. It's very complicated and a bit hard to read. All we need to see about this graph is, if you can see in the each of these three bars are identifying the source citations for articles within the journal Cognitive Science. And what we can see that is in the year 2000, which is the top bar, there's sort of quite a wide range of different areas being cited from. So the different colors are kind of breaking down what subject areas those cited, who is being cited in cognitive science, and how related or closely related are to each other. So you can see quite a wide diversity there in that top bar. Middle bar is 2007, and then bottom bar is 2014. And as we go down through those 14 years of development, it gets more sparse. Essentially, cognitive science begins to narrow and narrow as a field. We see less and less, fewer and fewer citations from outside of essentially standard cognitive psychology, to the point where these days, cognitive science is really just a cognitive psychology journal. And that really sort of tells us quite a bit about how the discipline didn't develop. And also, though, I guess, how dominant certain ways of thinking were. So the paper I'm drawing this from looks at a number of different aspects, but that sort of is perhaps one of the easiest indicators. Another key indicator is if they look at undergraduate cognitive science programs across the United States. Aren't all that many of those, actually. Most cognitive science programs are still kind of tucked away as a thing you do after you do your real degree. But on these undergraduate psychology program or undergraduate cognitive science programs, there's Freudian slip there for you. On these undergraduate cognitive science programs, we see of the sort of 6 core areas, or 7 core areas if we break cognitive science out as a sort of a separate element there. Which of these areas is not represented in undergraduate curricula? And we can see anthropology there, this orange bar, is barely represented at all in undergraduate curricula for cognitive science these days. Right? What I think is important there is that if there's one aspect of life that cognitive science has never got to grips with, it's people living their lives in the real world. It has never had a sort of a central role in what the discipline of cognitive science is. And it's something that really, I guess, is indicative of, or sort of fits with what Varela, Thompson, and Rush are pushing against or noting as an issue, a sort of a wide open problem for cognitive science to deal with, is that if you can't deal with people living their real lives, what are you really up to? Okay. So really, following Barbara van Eckart here, we might talk about cognitive science, but in fact, we're still really dealing with what we might say are cognitive sciences. Kind of lots of different people who are kind of studying similar kinds of things, but have never really got together and decided, this is what we do, this is who we are, and these are the ways in which we go about doing it. Okay. So I did mention I'd sort of talk about artificial intelligence as well. An awful lot of the artificial intelligence work and computer science work that would have been sort of lots of enthusiasm and optimism about in the kind of late 90s or late 80s, early 90s, is the kind of work that now underpins what's called machine learning, or what's still called AI, although it's called AI just for branding reasons more than anything else. We won't get into arguments about precisely the sort of definitions of things, but very, the kinds of things that we've seen explode over the past year in terms of natural language chatbots and artificially generated images and face recognition and so on, that's where connectionism ended up. It ended up sort of absorbed into these engineering activities rather than as a sort of a strong tool for understanding human beings and human ways of doing things. And in fact, the cognitivist underpinnings that go with almost all of this engineering work, all of the language models and the facial recognition processes, and even the development of artwork and so on, essentially became irrelevant and just unquestioned. It's not part of what's going on in that field now. So it essentially broke off and just became its own thing. Which leaves us 30 years later with all of the same problems that Varela, Thompson, and Roche were flagging. Again, as Amy mentioned at the start. Now, in this section as well, the authors sort of flag their concerns about representationalism and the fact that the computational model of cognitive science, the dominant view of how we should understand thinking and the mind and how people interact with their world and each other, that was foundational to the development of a thing called cognitive science, the thing that everyone got excited about and then that we've all maybe got a little bit disillusioned with over the last little while. The foundation of it is at this sort of representational level, or with the commitment to this idea of representations being the means by which we should understand meaning or thinking or experience and so on. And Varela, Thompson, and Roche in this first chapter are really just sort of setting up some of their issues. They're just going to name some of the problems that they can see, and what we'll see is these will be unpacked in much more significant depth over the next few sessions. So I'm just going to, again, follow them here, note that they name them, but I'm not going to try and unpack them in any great detail, precisely because I don't want to steal the thunder from all of the wonderful speakers. It would just be, a bit mean of me to just give you all the answers now and leave nothing for anyone else to do. So they sort of identify, crucially, 3 assumptions of representational thinking. First assumption, there is a separate we who does the knowing. Okay, so there's the distinct we. We inhabit a determinate world with particular properties, right? That's a fundamental assumption. And for that, basically for us to come to terms with or understand that determinate world, we recover those properties by representing them in some way. Okay, so some means of computation, or whether it's symbolic or sub-symbolic representation, so whether we're doing old school computational cognitivism or whether we're doing new school connectionist cognitivism, there is a sort of the formation of representation. So I've thrown these rather oddly onto the slide here, and of course, I don't know, being the perceptive bunch you are, you probably know what's coming next, because this is, as you'll see, the same diagram I showed you earlier, right? Precisely the concerns they have with representations is that they mess with this relationship. In particular, they kind of break the circle in a rather jarring and, for the most part, and this is the real sort of crime, as it were, in an unknowing or careless manner. So the real concern with representationalism is that no one using it realizes or acknowledges that this is a step they take. Or at least, so there are possibly ways or circumstances in which it's okay to start talking about or using the concepts of representations. But if you don't realize that as soon as you do so, you've introduced this break, then you're going to lead yourself astray. And more particularly, you're going to lose the possibility of keeping track of and work with certain kinds of relationships. So as I said, we'll leave the unpacking all that to later, but it's the violence done to the relationship between a person and their world that is at issue here. And understanding that act is a crucial part of getting to grips with the enactive approach and sort of coming to terms with, there's got to be a different way of us going about this. So if we acknowledge that we want to keep the circle whole, certainly in the first instance, certainly until we have some really good reason to break it, if we acknowledge our own experience, which is to say that we always find ourselves already embedded in it, that we are not separated or entirely distinct from our world, but immersed in it as an ongoing activity, then we kind of resist representationalism, certainly in the first instance, until we've got a handle on what it is we want to be doing. So how do we start doing cognitive science if we don't start with representations? What do we do as cognitive scientists if we've taken away the one thing that supposedly united cognitive scientists? So the authors sort of put it like this: the fundamental insight of the enactive approach, as explored in this book, is to be able to see our activities as reflections of a structure without losing sight of the directedness of our own experience. Right? So it is just, I guess, put bluntly, as a human being doing cognitive science, don't lose sight of your humanity. Right? Remember that you are a human being doing cognitive science. It feels like it should be irrelevant. Turns out it's kind of not. But if we're going to do that, we're going to need tools that aren't normally available to us. This fits with a host of other work that was also sort of unfolding over the course of the 20th century. So in one sense, this is a revolutionary view, and it certainly remains a revolutionary viewpoint within cognitive science. But there is a whole other interdisciplinary field of study to which this is a sort of standard realization. So the authors explicitly mention Alexander Koyré and also mention Thomas Kuhn. And these are people who studied the process of doing science and pointed out that it's a human endeavor. It's, again, kind of odd to point that out, it seems, but nevertheless, a kind of revolutionary thing to do. It still niggles a lot of people. I see sort of arguments in social media all the time in the circles in which I move, at least. One of the more famous names here is Thomas Kuhn. He's also one of the easiest people to read here. This is much like the enactive literature, because it gets into reflexive work very quickly. The science and technology studies work is also quite dense and difficult to access. But the delightfully, wonderfully short Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn is an excellent place to start. And a quote from that: the depreciation of historical fact is deeply and probably functionally ingrained in the ideology of the scientific profession, the same profession that places the highest of all values upon factual details of other sorts. What's Kuhn saying there? He's kind of basically saying that part of what you learn to do as a scientist is ignore the fact that your science has a history, that it came from somewhere, that it's the product of people doing their things. So in the book, Kuhn unpacks this idea that scientific understanding is produced through a process of people making decisions, engaging in carefully regulated professional practices, and in dialogue with particular communities. All of that stuff gets pushed to the background, essentially sort of seen as sterile by much of the way science is done, because the intention is just to sort of focus on what's in front of us, and the means by which we focus, right? How we've oriented ourselves to look at something in particular, the tools we use in order to sharpen our perceptions so as that we can see some particular phenomena that we're interested in. All of those things are kind of as absent in our experience as my glasses are, right? So if my glasses only become a sort of a thing for me if I take them off and I'm desperately, screamingly in need of them, right? While my glasses are on, I just see, and I can just wander about and do my daily life without really worrying about glasses. Whereas sort of Kuhn is kind of pointing out here, you're wearing glasses all the time as a scientist. I know you put them on in undergrad and you've never taken them off, so you take them for granted, but they've been there and they came from somewhere and they affect your vision in particular ways. When you talk about science as a thing that people do, you recognize that science has all of the power and politics and sort of pragmatism and corner cutting and compromising that is invariably the case in any human activity, particularly when it's a collective activity. And when you start to incorporate these recognitions and realizations within the way you do science, you just do science a little bit differently. So you take the sort of recognition of the fact that we're already embedded in our world, that that world has certain characteristics to it and is sort of flooded with power and politics and pragmatism and so on, then the way you think about and approach asking questions changes. So of course, and for cognitive science in particular, because this is the science of people, right? This the science of humanity. Cognitive science as the study of ourselves, as our nature, our possibilities. Well, that transforms our understanding of ourselves. If it didn't, it was clearly wrong, right? So either we already know all the answers, or science will give us answers that are new. If science gives us answers that are new, which it should do, then it has changed our understanding of ourselves. If it changes our understanding of ourselves, we will ask different questions. We will interpret observations differently. We'll make different measurements. And that, of course, is going to change cognitive science and the study of ourselves and our nature and our possibilities. And so we get into, as Varela, Thompson, and Rush put it, this hall of mirrors. We just get spun around this cycle, and it gets dizzying pretty quickly. So how do we cope with that dizziness? What kinds of methods and resources can we make available to ourselves that will allow us to sort of take that different perspective and find our way with it? And that essentially is what the rest of the book will be about. Crucially, while the focus is on the halls of academia, it is mirrors all the way down, right? So we start with our common sense. This is, you show up at your undergrad, and big part of your undergraduate studies is we're going to change what your intuitions are. But you've already shown up with intuitions, particularly when it comes to your understanding of yourself and people. So these are, this is true of all disciplines, not both humanities and both sciences and humanities. So you start with the common sense, but that common sense it too has a genealogy, right? It too has a history. It came from somewhere. And the science of humanity doesn't stay within the walls of academia, right? So we can see it. And I'm just going to use movies here. I mean, God alone knows what we've got dug into literature. This goes deep. But once, where do we see the science of cognitive science showing up and being fed back to us to change what we can imagine about ourselves and what we can imagine about people and how people think and so on? So there's a sort of a constant flow and process of change, which we have to come to grips with. And that, it's dizzying, and it is a challenging viewpoint. The world, society, cognitive science, and cognitive scientists are continually new and never fully determinate. So cognitive science must be capable of recognizing and theorizing that. So a nice, lovely quote here from Merleau-Ponty again. It's thus the essence of the thing and of the world to present themselves as open, to send us beyond their determinate manifestations, and to promise us something more to see. And I wanted to sort of touch on just a brief, I'm going to reference, I mentioned Fred Cummins before. Fred's based in UCD. This is a very simple experiment. The link to the YouTube video there is just for reference. So if you want to sort of pause the video and sort of take it down at some point, there's a series of videos about vision, which I think are very interesting. But in that first video, Fred talks about the science of vision and how it's normally conducted, and that it starts with the fixation cross. So the very simple experiment, and it's really very simple, is in a vision experiment, you would be asked to sit still, face your screen, and look only at the fixation cross. And then I would then pop up a picture at the fixation cross, and I'll know you'll have seen it, right? That's the basic principle. Fred's simple question is, what else can you see? So if you just fixate the fixation cross, right? Stay looking at it. What else can you see in the world around you? If you're like me, you can probably see quite a bit. And it's the nature of things that reality always overspills that which we are focused on or intending to look at. And again, we're into that sort of fundamental theme of the world being indeterminate, being too full to be fully determinate. And I'm going on way too long. So I'm going to move through these next couple of slides fairly quickly. They're getting at the same point, but I think this is actually the real core of chapter 1 and a fundamental part of the book throughout, which is to shift our understanding of understanding and to make us, to give us a certain confidence and to take away a certain anxiety. We have a tendency to think, well, if I understand something, I can write it down. You know, science is writing the book of the world. It's searching for the one truth so that we can write it down and fix it, and then we'll know it. But of course, there is another way of thinking about understanding, and this is not talking from the embodied mind at all. There's a few quotations from entirely separate authors, essentially trying to illustrate the same point from a few different angles. So Hannah Arendt talks about understanding as an unending activity by which we come to terms with and reconcile ourselves to reality. That is, we try to be at home in the world. Okay. Karen Barad talks about, unlike representationalism, which positions us above our outside the world we allegedly merely reflect on, a performative account insists on understanding thinking, observing, and theorizing as practices of engagement, right? These practical, physical things that we do, and they're part and parcel of the world we get on with. Two final sort of quick ones, one from the anthropologist Tim Ingold. Full understanding, in short, is attained not through translation, but through metamorphosis, right? If you understand something, you have been changed by it, and you can now interact with the world differently. That's what understanding is, not that you have been able to write it down. Text, as we know, tends to be rather ambiguous, as you'll find as you read through any book, but particularly this one. And Ludger van Dijk also talks about conceiving of the world as co-determined in action may help psychology to foreground the responsibilities that come with the place humans have taken up in the world and the space we hold open for other animals. Okay, so being in the world is what understanding actually means, or is certainly how we might think of understanding. So I want to do very quick. This is all taking much too long, and I apologize for running over. Look at me breaking my own rules immediately. So I'm going to start though with a sort of a brief exercise in consequential indeterminacy. But mostly this is an exercise to, if any of what has come before has made you feel a little bit nervous, this is an attempt to sort of settle your nerves a little bit, because you deal with indeterminate things all the time and you understand them very well. So I'm going to stop this sharing for a second. I'm going to share something else. And now I have an exercise for you. So class, everyone take out a pencil and paper, right? Or some kind of writing implement and something to write on. And we're going to reaffirm our identity multiple times here. Now, let me just do this. Okay, so what I want you to do is that I want you to write your signature. And I want you to do it 3 times. Okay, so just one above the other, one beneath the other. So I'll do it here. Right, so I want you to look at your signature. And I want you to tell me if it's identical to each other. Right? Generally speaking, you will find it isn't. So I've made 3 attempts here, and just for fun, I'm going to sort of change things up a little bit by using a different pen, or by stealing one of my children's crayons. Right? So there's 5 signatures for us to look at. You can sort of look at your own there. And what we'll generally find is that there's no one canonical signature. Right? There's no one true signature. No matter how many times you write your signature, you'll never know if one of them is the one that the others are bad copies of. Because that's not what a signature is. Right? A signature is technically indeterminate. Right? It doesn't matter that it has a particular, I mean, there's limits, right? And this is a sort of important too, that just because something is indeterminate doesn't mean anything goes. There's a whole bunch of things that I will reject as my signature, even if I myself write them. We've all probably found this in the last couple of years when we had to do signatures online and we had to try and draw it with a mouse, and just how offensive it was to us that I cannot write myself, I cannot present myself in this way. And the scroll I make with my mouse is not my signature. But I can do it with a crayon, right? So this sort of is a sort of fairly simple point, I think, which demonstrates that we needn't be afraid of indeterminacy, because an awful lot of the things that are most important to us are indeterminate, and we get on with it just importantly. What's actually important is understanding the flow of behavior and activity in which the signature got written down, right? So any one of the three that you've written, if it was at the bottom of the contract, you are bound to the contract. What matters is that it fits into the flow of activity in the right kind of way. Another very simple example is spoken language. Right? There is no one canonical pronunciation for any word. Some pronunciations are given more power than others, sure. But I'm a monolingual, right? So my disability in this group is I'm a monolingual, right? Everyone else here, or most other people here have more than one language. And I am grateful for you including me in the group by, using a language that I can work with. But as a native English speaker, there are dozens, hundreds of accents in English. No one of them will pronounce the words the same way. They're all perfectly valid. We can decide as a group, let's say this is the right pronunciation. But in fact, not even the Queen, as she was, spoke the Queen's English, because human voices change over time and our pronunciation changes in context. So these are indeterminate things that nevertheless don't challenge us in terms of our understanding. And so when we think of the mind and thinking as an indeterminate thing, it need not challenge us or make us despairing about the possibility of productively understanding it. So to sort of finish off quickly then, the theme of the book as we finish out the chapter are, in our present world, science is so dominant that we give it the authority to explain even when it denies what is most immediate and direct, our everyday immediate experience. So just don't let it do that, really, is what it comes down to. Unless we move beyond these oppositions, the rift between science and experience in our society will deepen. Neither extreme is workable for a pluralistic society that must embrace both science and the actuality of human experience. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because these concerns directly touch people's lives. They're not merely theoretical, right? How we conceive of ourselves will affect what we consider as valid as ways of interacting with each other, of treating one another, and of working with the world around us. And give you an example of this, Avi Beberhani is a cognitive scientist who works on the representation of people and the ways in which representations can be used as means of oppression and suppression. So quote from a recent paper of hers: when future behaviors are predicted based on past stereotypes, individuals are deprived of the opportunity to challenge stereotypes and realize their full potential. So that, I think, basically brings us round through the first chapter. Hilariously, I did all of that without sort of pausing on it. I had to swing back and add this slide in at the end because I thought, I never talked about inaction. But there we have it. So here's the introduction of the inactive term. I'll just nod that it's there, say, welcome to the vocabulary, thanks for coming, and we'll use the rest of the book to actually unpack this. The first chapter is really just setting up the stage for the inactive approach to properly step on. And in fact, we won't even get onto that until sort of much later in the term. Where will we go next? Well, next we'll have Philippe Louan, who will talk about chapter 2, what we mean by human experience, the phenomenological tradition and its relations to science. Philippe will be followed by Marek van Voigt, who will talk about symbols and the cognitivist hypothesis. The boogeyman has entered the room. Antonino Raffoni then will talk about the eye of the storm and the self. So you've already noted in your signatures, right? You've affirmed your identity in 3 different ways. None of them was the same. We're more or less going to sort of keep track of the fact that that's true no matter what way you decide to affirm your identity. Giuseppe Pagnoni will deal with this idea of emergentism and connectionism. As I mentioned, that these are terms that have drifted apart from one another a little bit recently in cognitive science. And then Constant Casar will talk about selfless minds and getting into the idea of cognition not as computation, but as embodied action in our final presentation section. So I will stop the slide sharing bit. I will thank you very much for your patience and apologize, fall on my sword, for breaking my own rule and speaking for way too long. So what I would like to do now, actually, just before, I know we're going to probably take a quick break to allow people some comfort and also possibly some caffeine and or a glass of whiskey or whatever it is for you at this time of the day. But before we do that, I thought we would, I don't know if a few of the other presenters are here, and if maybe we hear from them before we finish up. Thought it might be a sort of a useful little exercise just to get some other voices into the room, which are desperately important. And one of the simple things we maybe do a sort of quick introduction, and then I thought it might be a sort of a fun thing to do to point out where we first came across the book, actually. So this is my copy. I've also got this one. This is more recent acquisition. This is the one I used back when I was a DPhil student in the University of Sussex. So Ezequiel de Paulo, and I was doing my PhD at the same time as Hanny Diar, and Tom Freze and Mark Stapleton and others. So I was very fortunate to sort of be in the mix and in the throng with all of that. And you just couldn't be part of that group and not get sort of drawn into this text. So this was bought on the Sussex campus, and probably chapter 9 was where I stopped the first time. But you know, I was enthused enough to come back and keep moving through it, and I'm glad I've done so. So I can't quite see all of the names, but I don't know if any of the others want to jump in. If we maybe try and go from in the sequence that we'll be presenting. Actually, is Philippe still here?
I think Philippe is here and Giuseppe is also still here.
Excellent. Philippe, do you want to say hi?
Hi. Sure. Give me one. Can you hear me well? Okay. The last one, I can microphone if ever. Apparently the Bluetooth connection might not be very stable. So let me know if I'm not getting signal. It's more or less. I'll no, it'll be simpler.
Okay, maybe that sounds better. Okay, great. Well, hello everyone. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'd like, first of all, to thank the organizers of this for having me on board. I've always appreciated the spirit that animates the Mind and Life Institute, and to me, it's again, it's quite an honor to be participating in this, to be invited by this. I would like, he's not here, but to thank also Michel Videbol, who gave my name, I think, to Amy. I think that was the connection initially, so I think that's quite kind, generous of him to think of me. Should I give my background now, or just say how I encountered the book? What did you have in mind, Marek?
Well, I mean, maybe just a sort of a one-sentence sort of background, just to give us your perspective, and then a sort of a
right. Yeah, very quickly. Well, it's not long to explain my background anyways. I studied philosophy at the Université de Montréal in partnership with the Université de Rouen. Finished my PhD a couple of years ago under the supervision of Nathalie Deprat, notably, and Maxime Doyon. I specialize in Husserlian phenomenology, which is why I was asked to present chapter 2, which deals, well, it's the main chapter, let's say, that deals with the connection with phenomenology. So that's the background I'll be bringing into this conversation. I remember encountering, I can't remember exactly when I encountered the embodied mind. I remember it was a friend of mine who was very fond of the cognitive sciences and thought I should look into this book during either my master's or PhD. So I can't remember exactly when, but I remember that I was quite pleasantly surprised with the book. I was astonished, first of all, that it was even possible to attempt to combine such disparate disciplines into one book. And to me, I mean, you pointed this out, Marek, in your presentation. I was surprised to see the data on it, but I mean, it seems to be an almost inevitable trend in the sciences that we over-specialize. And so just the mere effort of bridging these disciplines together, to me, was already quite a bold and astonishing step. So I was pleased by that, but more particularly, I was pleased by the fact that they were trying to bridge phenomenology, in which I was starting to specialize at the time, and Buddhism. And that to me, kind of confirmed the deep hunch that I had. I initially was very much interested in Zen Buddhism, and it's through this interest that I was led to phenomenology. And so here I felt like I was coming full circle. I was rediscovering Buddhism through the lens of phenomenology, and that to me was deeply satisfying. So I think both of these disciplines share a commitment to groundlessness, as they clearly explain in the book. I'll be emphasizing this in my presentation. I'll be building on this idea of groundlessness or non-duality, which is beautifully symbolized by the Enzo symbol that I was happy to see numerous times in your presentation, Marek. I've already included it in my presentation as well, so that might be, I guess, one of the crucial symbols that we'll have to try to make sense of as we go through this book. So that's pretty much what I had to say. Thank you again for having me on board, and it's going to be a pleasure to meet all of you, hopefully throughout these discussions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Philippe. So I'll be looking forward to hearing from you. So we have still, we have Antonino, I think, do we still?
Antonino's here, yeah. He actually has to leave in a bit, so maybe he can introduce himself next. And Giuseppe.
Hello, delighted and honored really to take part in this wonderful program and so interesting reflections. And so chapter 4, which will be my focus, will deal with the self, which has been already introduced as an important aspect topic today. So it's really regarding the self in a dynamic way, and this relates, of course, to the traditional Buddhist psychology views in terms with reference to the 5 aggregates, so-called. And interestingly, in chapter 4, there is this also a link to the phenomenologist views. And actually, there are very interesting trends nowadays, really, to conceive the self, reconceive the self in dynamic terms. For example, Sean Gallagher's proposal of the pattern theory of the self, which very nicely resonate with chapter 4. And I've been lucky to be involved in an international project with, I think, a dozen of researchers in contemplative science and philosophy with Sean Gallagher and others to study the bridge between pattern theory of the self, with actually based on an active approach, and traditional Buddhist psychology. So there will be reflections about these proposed that, of course, are also very relevant for practice, for mindfulness practice in general, contemplative practice. And the idea, what are the benefits for psychological well-being of making the self more flexible rather than rigid, and implications also for psychopathology. And also nicely, the chapter is a part that deals also with the momentariness, actually, of actually cognition and related brain activity, with some very interesting views also about some rhythms in the brain, which can be related also to conscious experience and mindfulness. So this will be some of the topics that will be really interesting to really approach in actually in dialogue with you. Many thanks.
And thanks for coming along this evening, Antonino. So do we have, actually, and I just realized, Antonino, would you like to say something just very quickly about your first encounter with the embodied mind? Was there sort of one point that stood out as, well, that's when you picked it up, that's when you started to get stuck into it?
Thank you, and thank you very much for your so interesting lecture, Marek. So you mean with the approach, or actually the book itself?
Well, I figure if we're talking about the book, we'll talk a little bit about the book.
Yeah, I think the book has been really, and as other books actually of Francisco Varela, so inspiring I have to say, since when I was a student in psychology, for really these broad views, and I would say really major change of paradigm. So, and then I could see when I started my Buddhist practice, how this actually paradigm and these theoretical views could also be linked to life in a sense, no? And not just represent a kind of theoretical framework. So obviously there is theoretical depth, there is, I think, elegance also in the way in which these views are formulated, with broad implications for individual and society.
Excellent, thank you. And do we still have, there's so many faces, it's hard to find people. So is Giuseppe still here?
Yeah, I think Giuseppe, if you're still here.
It's like a seance. Can you hear us, Giuseppe?
I can
unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. We can't hear you, Giuseppe. We can see you speaking, but
How about now? Can you hear me? Okay. So, no, I'm very, very happy and honored too to be part of the faculty of the Embodied Mind coursework. For me, this book has a special place in my heart and in my life, because I discovered this book while I was doing my first year of PhD in neuroscience in the lab of Professor Rizzolatti. And since I did not feel like working in electrophysiology with the monkey, for the first year, I kind of basically played hooky and found this book that was the Embodied Mind that I just came across by chance in a bookshop, and I was intrigued by the cover, and so I bought it. And then I was completely captivated by this book, and basically spent the first year of my PhD hiding from the faculty and just reading this book and a few of the books that were cited by the book and the papers, and it really provided like an orientation for the rest of my research life. Really, it was a guideline, or even a lifeline maybe. And so it would be interesting to revise it after so many years. It has been quite a few years since my PhD. And there has been really the enactive vision or framework, as well as the neurophenomenology, has really seen a strong development in recent years. Perhaps it was really ahead of its time when it was published, when the book was published. But now there are, I would say that the most cutting edge research in the neuroscience, in cognitive science, really have been informed by this type of vision, consciously or unconsciously. And thank you, Marek, for a wonderful introduction. That was really good. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. Very kind. So, okay, so I think that's all of us speakers here. So, Enrique and Connie aren't on here at the moment, so we'll hear from them soon. So we might take a brief break for people to caffeinate, and we will return in, so what, sort of make a countdown for 10 minutes, do we? Or do we want to go something shorter? Was 5 minutes enough for people, or 5? Yeah.
Yeah.
5 minutes. I spoke too long, I ate into your break, but it's enough time to make a cup, so 5 minutes.
Thanks, Marek.
Okay, so yes, we have some sort of material for discussion in the chat, but it would be quite nice to hear voices other than mine. So if anyone would like to speak to a point that they have already added to the chat, then please feel free to do so. I will move to the text where the attempt to encourage you to be vocal fails. But I will only use the text. I'll expect a response. So let's be as diverse in the number of voices as we can manage. If anyone would like to go first. The bar, as I've said, is very low in terms of how you might like to prompt a discussion. If you aren't sure how you would articulate something, just say anything. The kind of the entry point, if you're really stuck, is just put one word in the chat. Say a word that jumped out at you, that's stuck in your head, that's not making sense. Just type that, put that in the chat. As we've clearly seen, getting me started talking will not be the difficulty. But in the meantime, I think we have a couple of hands up. So, Francisca, would you like to get started?
Hi, everyone. So I'm breaking the ice here. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really inspiring, and I think it was really wonderful as a starting point for all of us. I'm still very new to the subject, so I'm still inside the foundation of cognitive science part, and so I have still a lot to learn, so I'm very eager to be here. I wanted to start by asking a question more because I'm not sure I fully understood your explanation. Maybe some people here might have some ideas and suggestions for this, because while you were mentioning the circle where you had the known, knower, and the means of knowing, for me it seems difficult, obviously, because of all the educational way that I got, that how can we then study all these small parts that compose the whole, and how can we study the whole process? Because I know that the whole is bigger than its components in the sense, that's why we're going through this approach, but still the parts still have relevant information for us. So how can we integrate them and not look at them isolated, but still look at them separately and then integrate? What are the processes that normally you can go through? Sorry, Marek, we're not listening to you. Sorry.
Sorry. There we go. We can hear me. You'd think we'd have all these habits now. But yes, no, an excellent question. Also the hardest question. So this is a question that I have genuinely struggled with professionally too, because my background is in psychology, and ideally we want to be doing experiments and you know, empirical work and so on. But in fact, there is a challenge to it, and crucially, and I'll be very interested actually to hear from others on this point. Probably the most important step, though, is to realize that that kind of reflection is required. So that at any stage, a decision about what methods to use and what tools to use is a compromise that is being driven by a particular perspective or purpose that you have in asking the question that you have. So when you go to do an experiment, it's because you are trying to sort of the traditional way of looking at it is, well, I want to uncover something about the world, and so I will conduct a neutral experiment which will allow me to observe or measure that which I want to understand. In reality, of course, what's going to happen is so the most common way in which this often sort of shows up in our language is we talk about data collection, as though the data were just lying around and we just had to go and pick them up. But in fact, what we do is data production. We put an apparatus in place, we design an experiment, we force people into behaving in just a small number of ways, and then we sort of look for patterns in that. But of course, it's almost like there's been a global conspiracy to shape people's behavior in particular ways. So in psychology, we have lots of blandly painted rooms that are poorly furnished with computer screens. And we essentially have, there's a global conspiracy to reduce human behavior to tapping on a computer in order to standardize human behavior. And if you sort of recognize that there has been such a professional effort to standardize behavior, a lot of that work is perfectly fine, some of it anyway, but as soon as you realize that the amount of effort that has gone into standardizing that behavior, you kind of go, oh, is that it? And you realize, oh, well, we need different methods then. Well, what'll we do? Well, how about go out into the world and engage with people in their day-to-day lives? And there are other, certainly a wide range of qualitative methods available in which that kind of work is done. So once you know what it is that you're trying to do, and once you recognize that whatever decision you've made, this is the piece of apparatus I'm going to use, this is the thing I'm going to ask people to do, and so on. Once you recognize that all of those are choices that you as a scientist are making, and that you that will help you realize what kind of knowledge you're producing. And it'll also make you self-critical and understand that you won't overstep. There isn't any way out of the circle, unfortunately. They're just, but what you can do is understand what your aims and ambitions are, and then realize that, so what you have to come to do is to shape your tools and your questions and your methods accordingly. And so it becomes a sort of a process of iteration like that. But there isn't there's no God's eye view, there's no neutral technique, unfortunately. But there is a self-awareness in the way that you can actually do the work.
Thank you for your answer. I also believe there's no neutral view, because there's no neutral way of doing it, because there's no neutrality in life as well. So,
yeah. Would anyone else like to come in on this point? Actually, just where you'll need to, I think, perhaps just so to be, if you could raise your hand via the, that'd be great. On your chin.
Just a kind of a continuation, I guess. Wouldn't the indeterminacy, as revealed by inactivism and this line of investigation, wouldn't it sort of defeat itself, like in a almost like a contradiction? Because like this, whatever is, I don't know, like the result of this investigation is also indeterminate.
So it does feel that way. It's a bit dizzying, I think, when you start to get into this idea of that's it, that there is no one answer that we can get to. But if we shift our sense of what science is doing to understand it in a more purposive manner. So when we engage in science, there's something we're trying to get done. There is a kind of a broader activity in which we are participating, and we're looking for a particular kind of outcome. The stories we often tell ourselves in science is that all I'm looking to do is find out the truth. But as anthropologists and sociologists and so on have studied scientists, what they find is most of the time scientists are looking to participate in a profession which is structured in a particular way because government priorities fund certain things, the sort of cultural values of a given country or society want to produce or support or reaffirm certain outlines and outcomes. And the sort of the processes that are, they all have this kind of purposive aspect to them. So the sort of science has that sort of going on. And if you're just aware of what they are, then it's perfectly fine to have their purpose and go for it. So long as you sort of recognize that's what you're, again, that's what you're engaged in. And it's not that, so indeterminacy doesn't mean that anything goes. It just means that there will never be a stop to it. So that's one of the I think usefulnesses of useful aspects of the signature, the exercise, that if you use handwritten signatures, then you will always, the signature will always be different, but there is such a thing. It doesn't mean that anything will work as your signature. It has to be embedded in a series of practices that have the right kind of validity to them. It has to have been produced or evoked in the right circumstances and done in the right way to count and to be valid as a signature, or to commit you to a particular course of action and so on. So indeterminacy does not necessarily mean despair or hopelessness, but it does mean that it'll never be finished. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So in this case, if we take the signature, what would be the thing that produces it? Like what would be the criteria for judging whether that's a signature, and whether how would you be able to say that that's not it?
So that would involve a kind of number of things. That it's possible there has been research done on this, and I'm not aware of it. But for example, I gave the example of trying to draw a signature with a mouse that some of us have had to attempt to do over the past few years, and rejecting that it not being close enough to what I consider my signature is to count. So we could do some psychology on that, and do some research that explored under what circumstances people accepted something as a valid signature or not. There are other circumstances in which, well, is this if something is a valid or not signature will depend on what awareness or understanding they had of the activity that they were doing. So if I draw my signature, so I've invited you all to write a signature. If I say, unbeknownst to all of you, I snuck in a piece of paper onto all of your desks that is a contract which will make you give all of your possessions to me. And look, you have signed that contract. Now I own all your stuff. I think we'd probably get into an argument. We'd say, well, that's my signature, but it's not a valid signature because it wasn't properly embedded in me knowing what I was doing when I wrote what I wrote. And so what counts as valid or invalid, what is accepted or is a true signature or not, depends on a whole host of things beyond the ink marks on a page. And we would need to do research to explore what those things were, but also what we probably find is they would change as we did the research. When the more we found out about it, the more people might change their opinion of what constituted a valid signature, and that's where we get into that incompleteness, the always changing aspect of it.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So, Johanna, I'm not sure if in terms of sequence here.
If the people who have their hands raised, did you want to either dovetail with those previous points, or did you have new questions? Because we do have some other comments coming up in the chat as well, but if you feel free, if you'd like, Atul, just jump in.
Maybe I can maybe I misunderstood you, Marek, in response to the question of Francisca on the circularity. I thought you said something like that there is no neutral lens, unfortunately. We can only, we are always involved in it. But I thought that word unfortunately was interesting there, because isn't part of the non-dual understanding to embrace that circularity and to kind of step away from the idea that there is a pre-existing outer world that we cannot access. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that, the use of the word unfortunate there.
Yes, I was about to say you are absolutely right, but then I realized that would use the word absolute, and then we'd begin the same problem. So you are correct. I think that I have 20 years of working with this book have not shaken the intuitions and standards of the profession and the work in which I conduct a lot of my business. So you are, I was about to say it again, you are very correct, or you are astute and perceptive in picking up on that notion of unfortunate. So it will partly come from this power and politics that I mentioned, right? That in order for to manage conflicts of point of view or perception within the particular culture in which I work and live, the means by which you achieve superiority and dominance is by drawing on a supposed higher or neutral or absolute point of view. And if you take away that capacity for conflict resolution, then I have to be much more democratic and inclusive in the way that I manage conflicts, right? So now, instead of appeal to a particular set of values, a means of answering certain questions or producing certain data, that in fact, what I have to do is whatever conflicts or disagreements I have with a person or different points of view, I have to work it out with them in collaboration and coordination. And we cannot, we can't move to a neutral value we both agree on. We just have to both transform ourselves in such a way that works. And that's quite an intimidating or challenging point of view from someone who has the kinds of bad habits, I guess we might call them, or habits at least, and sort of cultural perspective. And particularly within the domain of science, right? Particularly within the profession where these things are raised to the status of an absolute. So thank you for that observation. Yes, and like I said, very astute. Anyone else want to come in on that one? Roast me over the coal.
Yeah, there is a text I think in English was about Varela's text from 2000 that I think in English is 4 Buttons for the Future of Cognitive Science. And just in this text, the main idea I'm reading from Spanish, so I don't know if it's the most correct way of putting it. It was the idea of circularity was thought to be like a co-determination between descriptions in first and third person. And talking about this point that you're saying, answering the question of Francisca, I would like to understand more, since it was the first chapter was a little bit about that. What is this? Because I think the main point from where I am understanding all of the discussion is really how to create an intermediate point where you can articulate the first person experience with the third person, that is the science, the thing that usually we call science, no? And the authors find in mindfulness a kind of possibility of reflection about this first experience and be able to understand their position in the world, so it would be able to find another meaning to this third observation that could be science. But from this point of view, what are the specifics of this circularity? Because, like, to me, the other concepts that Varela put on those texts sounds very obvious to me: emergence, embodied. But this idea of circularity, I don't know if and I think it's something that is appearing in other questions, like how how is being conceived methodologically and in an epistemological way this kind of movement approach that is a non-static way of putting two things in a co-determination way. I think that's the difficult thing to capture here, that I would like some insights, because sometimes I get really lost with this part of the argument.
Okay, so you know, that's a good question. It's a difficult challenge, and there are two ways in which I think there's sort of two pragmatic ways in which it's addressed, and that are dealt with in some of the writings around this. And then there is also just that more fundamental perspective or change in attitude that you referred to directly. So you talked about this idea of a non-static viewpoint, that because we cannot do first and third person description simultaneously, all we can do is learn to move in the right way. So there is no one point where we can sort of settle down and say, right, that's it, we're finished now. We've done it all. Here's the one full description of everything. All we can ever do is know we're going somewhere. And if we have a sense of where we have come from and where we might want to go to, then we'll have a sort of a better coordination with the world. We'll have a sort of a better understanding of how to get done what we're looking to get done. So that change in attitude of not finding satisfaction in the complete description that we can, put in a book and recite to people, but finding satisfaction instead in a capacity to do the next thing we need to get done, to be able to, as Hannah Arendt put it in the quotation I used, just be at home in the world. As soon as you can do that better, that'll be the satisfying understanding. More pragmatically and more methodologically, there are two ways in which this gets unpacked. One there's a 2004 or 2005 paper by Evan Thompson in which he talks about it explicitly. So this is unpacked in the later chapters of the book too, but he captures it quite nicely. I'll have to try and track down the reference and put it in the Slack channel. He talks about a tacking back and forth between first person and third person. So that we will do some third person work that will raise questions on reflection. So we'll need to do some first person work that in turn raises further questions on reflections. So we go back to doing third person work, and that at each point it is being informed by the work being conducted in the other. So at no point do we kind of put on the blinkers and put on the sort of narrow focus and go, right, well, let's just find all of the answers here. But that we sort of include that tacking back and forth. The other viewpoint, of course, is this is the sort of the cheap answer, as it were, is, well, what's between first person and third person? We go with second person point of view. So the second person perspectives of neurophenomenology and so on, where we explicitly engage with other people in a means that we will allow them to change our point of view, and we will understand that our engagement with them will change them in different ways. And there are a number of second person methodologies that are being continually developed to various different kinds, particularly qualitative methodologies in psychology, neurophenomenology having fundamentally second person aspects to it. But that is that's a kind of a fairly revolutionary viewpoint within science too. The idea that you would do your science by speaking or addressing someone directly, rather than observing them again in the supposedly neutral manner. And it changes what you consider a valid answer and a satisfying answer. But all with this aim of kind of making sure that you recognize your place in this circularity at all times, and that you can't hit pause button. You can't stop it. Does that help? Is there any satisfaction in that answer?
Yes, like just to pass to all the other people. Yes, I think one interesting thing about that is a change of perspective about what methodology is, because what you are saying is basically like it's not the way of seeing itself that configures methodology. Like it's not just like if I gonna run through some kind of sense monitoring or doing a couple of interviews or meditation, but which meaning can configure the integration between those, a lot of those kind of process together, so to try to capture the emergent that we are trying to understand. One thing that sounds to me very interesting about that is like sounds like a change a little bit at the paradigm of techniques to understand like dimensions of the same phenomenon.
Yeah, and always, of course, with that sense of, well, what is it I'm trying to do? And that is often the hardest thing for a scientist to acknowledge and articulate and to say, to be honest and say there is a thing I'm trying to get done here that isn't just observe and record. Okay, is there anyone who wants to sort of follow up immediately on that, or? Okay, so I'm not sure. Do the hands in my participants list? Sorry, Hans. Yeah.
Okay. Well, my name is Hans Contreras. I am here in Peru. First at all, I want to share many thanks for your presentation and for all the group that make it possible. It's a wonderful opportunity to study Varela's thinking. I want to make you a question, please. Is specifically about the textbook in the page number 7, where we can find a conceptual chart that, in my opinion, is a wonderful thing of this book. And I want to make the question, what's your opinion 32 years all after the publication? What's your opinion about this conceptual chart? We have to make some annex, some now, no, after 32 years old. And if we have to put Varela in the chart, where do you put it? Where do you put him in the chart? Obviously in the inactive ring, but near to cognitive psychology or near to philosophy or whatever. What's your opinion, please? Thanks.
Thank you. I will be very interested to hear other people's opinions on this one. I almost set it as a piece of homework, actually. So it was almost if you do study cognitive science, if it's part of your background, pick a few cognitive scientists that you think are kind of significant figures now and add the dots. It's an interesting activity in itself. What is also interesting is that once the diagram has been set up in the way that it has, some things become possible, some things become impossible. So, for example, it becomes impossible to be a neuroscientist and a philosopher and not a cognitivist in this diagram, because the way that they have been laid out, if you want to be halfway between neuroscience and philosophy, the only way to do it is go through the middle. And if you're an activist, or if you use the inactive approach, then you end up getting stuck. So this is a characteristic of all tools, of everything that we use. What we noted early on when, with Zoom, the gathering together bit before a presentation starts is weirdly difficult, particularly strange that it's difficult given that all we're doing is sitting doing nothing. But it's an odd, strange experience, because Zoom doesn't do that kind of gathering very well. The same is true of any diagrams we decide to draw. Some things will be possible to illustrate with that diagram and other things will not. And where are we putting Varela? I think we'd probably have to dot him around a little bit. And I think that's okay. You know, multiple identities, multiple enactions of a given professional viewpoint. So there's we could just color in the whole outside circle and sort of be happy. Though certainly, Varela is more active towards the end of his life and career in neuroscience and philosophy than in linguistics, for example. So 32 years later, the effect of all of the authors is being felt in many of these disciplines. Though notably, I think, as I mentioned, artificial intelligence has kind of drifted off and become its own thing to a large extent. And so it has solidified around a number of methods and techniques, and doesn't seem interested in learning certain kinds of things anymore, because it has become again, sort of commercial and political interests have determined that artificial intelligence is fostered in certain, cultivated in certain ways and less in others. But there is, in this very room, people working in computer science and artificial intelligence. I say this room, not in this room, because I'm only the only one here and I don't do it. But in this Zoom room, there are people working in computer science who will be using artificial intelligence methods and are clearly, at least in action, curious. So there is a sort of a constant interplay. There is always a field of possibilities between disciplines that people are willing to sort of tentatively explore. And that won't ever go away. That's, it's part of the messiness of science and research work. So I'm afraid not as perhaps determinate an answer as you would have liked, Hans, but I hope it makes some sense. Does that seem to sort of fit with things for you? Okay.
Marek, if you don't mind me to step in for this question.
Please.
Well, thank you very much, Hans, for your question of where to locate Francisco in this chart. I never thought about it, but this is very relevant. We need to remember that he did his PhD under Wiesel on the visual system of the fly. So it's really, neuroscience. But as you said, Mike, he's also, make an enormous contribution to the philosophy of science as well. So maybe we can put Francisco in the third dimension, on the top of this two-dimension chart. Because actually neuroscience is on opposite with philosophy here. This is, I don't know if that was meant to be significant for us, but it's in direct opposition with neuroscience. I would like also just thank you very much for your talk. I wanted also to, because when listening to you about cognitive neuroscience, I was really wondering why cognitive neuroscience took such hypertrophy in the science of psychology, because I look at, again, the psychology experimental, in the 80s, written by our, very good psychologists at the time with Piaget and Paul Fraisse. And when I look at that, actually, cognitive psychology was just one little part of what psychology was. And they were still getting a lot on Gestalt psychology, on Freud and the experimental psychology, and also on the neuropsychology, theory of information and cybernetic, psychology, genetic psychology, which was what Piaget was doing, psychology mathematics, and cognitive psychology, which is just a little one, and finally psycholinguistic and convergence. So this is interesting to see that 60 years ago, 50 years ago, actually the domain of the study of behavior, human and animal behavior, was much larger than what we now talk about cognitive psychology. And cognitive psychology is no less than, you know, the daughter of behaviorism. But interestingly enough, for possibly, you know, reason that has to in our society, as you mentioned several times, in the culture in which we are to do science, the need to be productive and to be able to have a reductionist view on which there is a general consensus. Cognition has been, you know, the big field to actually be dominant in the domain of experimental psychology, which is much larger. And this is absolutely true because I've also been teaching in psychology department that cognitive psychology has absorbed actually sensation and motricity and things like learning and memory and things like motivation, emotion and personality, perception, intelligence. But all these were actually open up to different type of investigation. It was not the only cognitive psychology which was dominant. So with the book on embodiment and inaction, we breathe again to open up again a field which was actually very, very open at some point. So
Thank you. Yes, I fully agree, and it is an interesting phenomenon professionally. I should perhaps not put too much store in a single anecdote, but it is a very illustrative one. So I'm going to share a story that happened at a conference. My wife is also a psychologist, and she was presenting at a conference. It was in Venice, so I made excuses to also attend this conference, despite the fact that I had nothing to say there. So what happened was at the coffee break, a number of people were sort of just sitting around. There was maybe 10 or 12 of us at a table, and some of the people at the table were teasing one of the others. So I didn't know any of them there, but they were teasing one person in particular and saying, "What are you doing? What are you even doing here? This conference isn't for you. You're a social psychologist and we're cognitive psychologists." The conference was thinking and reasoning, right? So, and the next session started, but because of course I was only there as a tourist, I didn't go. And thankfully the social psychologist was also left sitting at the table. So I asked him, I said, why are you here if you're not a cognitive psychologist? And he said, well, an interesting thing has happened in the last 20 years, which is that because cognitive psychologists can do experiments by putting one person down in front of a computer screen and having them press some keys, they can get an experiment done with half the resources and half the time that I can. So if I do proper social psychology, I need at least twice as many participants, and the way in which I analyze the data are much more difficult. So if you want to publish quickly in psychology, you have to use cognition and the information processing paradigm, just as you mentioned, just precisely as you said, Valerie, right? So the professional pressures meant that the most productive paradigm was the one that said a picture of a person's face is just as good as someone sitting across the table from you. And it is a social stimulus, ergo, you can do your psychology with a computer. So while for the psychologists, of course, what they experienced was, I say they, what psychology professions experienced was success in their profession. And of course, all of these experiments produce data, and the data can then be analyzed to according to certain principles that psychologists use. So you produce what looks like an answer because you've used the right methods. You've got statistical results. And as a psychologist, unless you have been trained to pause and reflect on that, which you're not because you're trained to publish it as quickly as you can, then you don't realize that you don't have an answer. You've just gone through the motions of getting an answer and have produced something that has all the appearance of an answer, but is divorced from all of the things that you might be interested in. You've taken the humanity out of the science. So that was a very telling and formative anecdote for me, sort of experiencing it. I was still just finishing, I was soon out of my PhD, and struggling with precisely the methodological questions that Francisca raised at the time. And I think it remains true to this day. Now, it's also true that the profession is messy. There's lots of qualitative work done. There are lots of other perspectives out there, but it is also certainly true that cognition and cognitivism is very dominant. Now I'm torn because on the one hand, we're very close to the end of time, and on the other hand, there are still questions being raised. So will we try and get one more question in, and then if we do that a little bit quickly, and then ask anyone who has a question but has not had an opportunity to speak, if you could flag it in the Slack chat, and I will make certain to at least respond there. That sound okay? So on my list of what I'm hoping is the order in which the hands were raised, Graham, you're up.
Hello, I better first quickly explain I'm from a very different background to everybody else here. I'm an architect and I'm doing a PhD at the Royal College of Art in London. And I had a whole question about disciplines, trans, post-discipline, but I think I'll bin all that because we're running out of time. So my question is, what is data?
Okay, we'll talk about lobbing a grenade in just before we finish.
Sorry. I'm really struggling with this one in my PhD because I'm doing post-empirical. The academy doesn't like it for obvious reasons. I have to create data and then analyze data, and I'm following the continental tradition, going back to Spinoza, Bergson, Nietzsche, Foucault, Deleuze, to Briadotti, critical feminist, new materialism. And somehow I have to magically create data and then analyze it, which is fundamentally flawed within the canon in which I'm situating myself.
Well, I guess the optimistic viewpoint there is we can produce data and draw, all engage with it, so long as we don't necessarily assume that there are any answers in it, or at least answers that stop questions. What are data? Yes, I guess we can talk all day about that one. It sounds like you're pretty well informed in terms of the kinds of places that we might look for different kinds of answers. But I suspect this is certainly a question without one answer, and it will, as is with so many other terms, will be contextually sensitive. So within the domain of cognitive psychology, certain kinds of things will count as data. Within the domain of critical feminist studies, other kinds of things might count as data.
With data that you deal with, how do you deal with liminality? With the data that's in a liminal space within, it's not material. For example, emotions, classic.
Yeah. So typically the answer is to either ignore that or force it through certain hoops. I mean, the way in which psychologists typically deal with something, now I say typically, this is very glib. Psychologists work with, for example, emotions in a number of different ways. Some might use neurophysiological methods, some might use interview techniques and phenomenological methods. Others will use self-report scales. The question that is driving the research will constrain the kinds of tools that you consider are valid and the kinds of data that you think will inform the outcome you're looking for. The vast majority of psychological research is done in a non-reflective manner that is entirely to do with these are the tools off the shelf for my profession, I will use them. And the psychologists actually get quite angry at you when you ask them to reflect beyond that. I have tended to find, you know, as I said, my wife's a psychologist, we get into arguments. But there are sort of there's just a host of things, but in any case, data are a commitment that you have made as to what you will be affected by, or what you will allow to change your perspective or point of view on what you're studying or what you're engaged with.
So therefore, how do you deal with the data you've excluded, or you just don't?
Certainly in the case of much psychological experiment and empirical work, you simply don't.
That'll do.
Yeah. There you go. Well, that was perhaps not as optimistic a finish as we might have liked, but there are weeks and weeks ahead of us in which we might explore a wider range of possibilities. But I think it is nevertheless a finish that sort of reminds us of the pluralism that we're going to be dealing with. That there will be a number of different perspectives, and at any given stage, what we will need to do is understand the process of what we're trying to do. And be able to orient and reorient ourselves as we negotiate what we're trying to do with both with others and also just with the world we're engaged with and the people we're engaged with. So for that, we are slightly over time, but I'm very grateful for everyone for coming along. I'm particularly grateful for everyone who spoke and who added comments to the chat and so on. And as I said, for those of you who we've not managed to get into the conversation here, please do transfer or translate your questions and comments and suggestions and half-formed thoughts into the text of the Slack channel, and we'll try and keep the conversation going there. And beyond that, we will see you in 2 weeks for chapter 2, an experience.
Yes, thank you so much, Marek, once again, and to everyone who's joined us. So as you know, we'll be coming back here on March 8th, and Philippe Blouin will be guiding us through chapter 2, whom we heard from this evening. And also just to let you all know, because you may be interested in some of the other programming we have going on online in a more continuous way. We also have that same week, actually the Thursday, March 9th, a talk by one of our EVA alumni members. So the EVA is the European Varela Award grant that we give, and she'll be offering a talk about her project that she completed. So that's a public talk. It'll also be live streamed, so you're welcome to join us either in the Zoom room for that or on YouTube. So thank you so much again, Marek, once again, and we will see you in just a couple of weeks. And we'll be in touch over Slack as well, so feel free. Have a good evening, everyone.